I'm so happy to be here. And one of the reasons is that I lived here for a short time. And in fact, without Cologne, I wouldn't be standing here. Your Stufer knows that because I did my habilitation here in history. And I think it's still the largest faculty probably in Germany with about 100 professors. And when you did your habilitation, you had to come up with 3 topics. And the faculty would choose one of the topics. There had to be topics from different centuries. So I chose something about the American Revolution and diplomatic history and European diplomatic history, but also national parks in America. And that committee, I was living in America at the time, the committee chose national parks in America. And I tell you, if this committee hadn't chosen national parks in America, I would not be standing here, because after that I was getting interested in environmental history. I had 2 weeks to prepare that, and since then I've been hooked. I'm so happy to be back. I haven't been back a lot at all in Cologne, even though I had masters I had to teach for years while I was in Washington, and a master and some doctoral students here. But I almost didn't come this time, not because I didn't have any time, but because I had to speak about natural catastrophes, and I really didn't want to do it as a historian, because everything has been said, and it's kind of boring what historians are saying, but I really think so. But and then I met my colleague, who is really the expert on natural catastrophes. I told him, Uwe Lübken, some of you may know him. I said, Uwe, I'm going to Cologne. What are you talking about? Learning from natural catastrophes. And he said, what? Haven't you read my article? 8 reasons why you cannot learn from natural. And he's right. I could have given you more than 8 reasons why you cannot learn from natural disasters. But I will pretend that you can learn as a historian. So is this the thing that works? It has... it works. And does this work as well? No, that doesn't, but it doesn't matter. Okay. So the topic of your series is disaster preparedness, and that was another reason why I really didn't want to come here, because disaster preparedness is not, who in the world as a historian would talk about preparedness? That's disaster management people, psychologists, medical doctors talk about disaster preparedness, but not historians, because it's a disaster management term, whereas historians, and that's basically my thesis, historians are interested in a preparedness, in a cultural preparedness, a social preparedness that goes way, way back. And so I ask you, are you ready for a disaster? Because what happens next is I will have a lot of slides. So many slides. It's little in comparison to the AI professors who I listened to last week at LMU. I think they have about 1 slide every 2 seconds. I have 2 slides per minute. So there will be 120 slides for you in my... It would be better if I could use this, but it doesn't. That doesn't work.
The pointer works.
The pointer works, so the battery can't be the problem.
We need a... Here it is.
Okay. So these are my questions. Quick. So what's so special about American disasters? My first question. How do Americans approach it vis-a-vis the Swiss, for instance? And I claim there is there's something special about America. Another question is, what's the difference between a meteorological event and a natural catastrophe?
Yes, now it's working.
Wonderful. Now nothing can go wrong. I'm interested in culture and vulnerability. A term that I coined is disaster optimism, because I claim that Americans are optimistic about disasters. I'll tell you how. And I show you this to show you this. I go back to 3 disasters in American history. And then I think that people have learned lessons or have not learned lessons, and I think you can actually learn more if people haven't learned lessons, and they haven't learned from Hurricane Betsy vis-a-vis Hurricane Katrina. And finally, because I'm really not working on American topics anymore, I'm really starting a project, actually a creative project, about Venice, because I love Venice. And so I will end by talking about the difference between how the two water cities, New Orleans and Venice, they have similar problems, over-tourism, flooding, and so on. So how social erosion, how these two cities have dealt differently in the history. Why is New Orleans vulnerable and has a lot of problems, and how has Venice survived for hundreds of years in a very precarious state? These are my questions. And it's way too much for 12 takeaways. Maybe we get there. So you can see here, America has a lot of fire. Red is fire in the west, hurricanes in the east, winds here. These are tornadoes. Basically every type of catastrophe. These are just the weather-related catastrophes. I'm not talking about geo catastrophes. I'm also not talking about diseases. Geo is like volcanoes or earthquakes. So one thing is you have every type of catastrophe in the United States. This shows you how many people die from catastrophes. Many in Africa, many in Asia, hardly anybody in North America or South America, despite relatively high populations. Many in China, Bangladesh, etc. There's something, but you also can see how many are reported. There are a lot reported, so people talk about it a lot. There's a lot in the press, there are a lot of books about it, but the most interesting is this graph. Why is it so important? Why do people talk about American catastrophes? Because of the money. Because the economic costs are enormous. Look at America, China, Japan, and America. They had, in this period of 28 years, in contrast to South America, in contrast to Africa, spent a lot of money in damages. They report a lot of damages. So this is why I think it's important for the Americans. This is why everybody's obsessed with catastrophes in America in the first place. Also, insurance companies are very lucky. So there's so much insurance. No insurance in most of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. Very little insurance in here, India, where you've got a lot of disasters, and in many parts of Asia, no insurance, but in America. People know that it's costly. They are exposed to, they live in areas that are disaster prone. You saw before the hurricanes in the southeast. This is the area in the United States where the population rises quickest, even though it's the most disaster prone, the hurricane prone. So what's the difference between a meteorological event and a natural catastrophe? Well, this is a meteorological event. You've all seen the Malibu fire. This one too, Hurricane Katrina. This one is an ice storm from 1998. By the way, it's the only ice storm in the history of America that cost more than $1 billion. This is why I chose it. 3 different disasters, all meteorological events at this point. But they become, so here is Malibu and San Francisco. There are winds coming across the Sierra Nevada. They go through the canyons, get accelerated, and when they hit the coast here, we hear about it because it hits a big city like Los Angeles, and it hits a city where a lot of billionaires live. That's Malibu. Here is Hurricane Katrina, or hurricanes that hit the southeast of America, another meteorological event. Meteorologists are interested in the speed and in how these winds are created. This is basically a cyclone. It's the same as a cyclone in China, in Shanghai. There's no difference from a meteorological point of view. And they're interested in the speed, but for historians this is all not important. It's important to know about it, but it's not so important. And here is the ice storm. In 1998, there was a lot of rain coming across the United States, then moving up into the cold north. And when it moved up into the sky, you can imagine, it all became ice. And when it came down in these areas, this is 100 millimeters of ice. Just imagine like this, just ice, not snow, which is enormous. And that caused the most costly ice disaster in American history. So I'm looking at these, but the interesting thing is this is Malibu, this is New Orleans, Katrina and the Malibu fires. It becomes interesting for historians as soon as a meteorological event hits a community, a city. Before that, it's not interesting for historians. Because if a tsunami happens somewhere in the Indian Ocean and there's nobody around, then we don't talk about a natural catastrophe. Here, I like the book Dancing with Disaster that Kate Rigby wrote, so I called it The Dance of Human Actors. Really what journalists who write books or newspaper people are interested in are disasters. It's about, when the wind hits or the fire hits a city, that's what everybody writes about, how to rescue, how to prepare for this, and that's about it. But as historians, we're interested in something else. We're really interested in the longue durée. So this is an advertisement for sandbags. That's something that a disaster manager is interested in, but a historian not so much. It's something that you do just before a disaster starts. What historians are interested in is, among other things, culture. Culture matters. And here, you can have a guess now. You can win a prize if you have a good answer. The only people totally unaffected by the power outage, you know?
That agrarian community, the Amish.
The Amish, exactly.
Yes.
So, interestingly, the Amish were able to survive. Everybody around them, they call everybody else the English, everybody around them was dealing with power outages. They couldn't move around. The streets were so icy for many, many days, you couldn't move around. People couldn't go to school. The Amish children went to school, they didn't even notice. Modern conveniences turned into inconveniences. Our conveniences remained largely the same, says one of the Amish people. So we may think that modernization and technical fixes are a key when it comes to preparing for disasters, but it isn't. It's certainly not the case. It's also not the case in this case. The Philippines, some of you know the book by Greg Benkoff, who is focused on the Philippines, and Greg Benkoff would say, well, I'm arguing that disaster is ingrained in culture, and eventually I want to ask, how is it ingrained in the US culture? But here you see, if you live in the Philippines, you have a certain type of informal architecture. You have even a philosophy and humor that is involved. So people would say, Bahanan naman, it's flooding again, and they say it with a laugh. It's happening, so they know how to deal with disaster. They've been dealing with it because it happens again and again. And it doesn't really matter that much, but it's a cultural, I think it's important to understand culture. It's not something that you can prepare for quickly. It's something that has happened over many centuries. And the other thing that Filipinos have been doing, the Philippine population, they have diversified. Diversity has been very important for resilience. So having different types of farming, fishing, casual labor, that reduces vulnerability. I also have I could add unorthodox, informal and unorthodox modes of reacting. For instance, they would release prisoners when a disaster would happen, and they would help, putting the sandbags up or moving the houses. And the prisoners, they knew they would go back to prison afterwards, but they would be helping, and it's just part of Philippine culture. In the US, it's different, and I argue that the culture, what is ingrained in the United States is optimism. And optimism is not hope. Optimism is a certainty versus hope is an uncertainty. You don't know about the future. Optimists know it's going to be good, and Americans know it's going to be good. We can do it. What was Obama's?
Yes, you can.
Yes, you can.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can. That was. So here I give you 3 examples to prove my thesis. Great Chicago Fire, 1871. It happened in a farm, not this one particularly. It killed 300 people in 1871, 17,000 structures destroyed, 100 people left homeless, 100,000. And apparently it started, that's the anecdote that everybody in Chicago will tell you. It was a cow that with her back leg would kick over a lantern in a stable, and then the straw was starting to, and then the whole city burned down. Not the whole city, but this is Lake Michigan here, and this is 9 square kilometers. It's like Heidenheim an der Brenz, for instance, a city in Germany. All of this burned down. Oops. So this is a Palmer Hotel built in 1870. You know what happened in 1871, the fire. Here, this is what it looks like. This is what Chicago looks like in 1871, a photograph. interestingly, this is something I found is that Americans are also dealing with culture. A lot of films, I could talk about Hollywood for an hour, Hollywood films that deal with disaster at certain times, but this is a melodrama so it becomes a melodrama. One of the worst disasters in history is turned into a melodrama in a film with a love story. Very American. The Palmer House before, the Palmer House after, and then it was rebuilt. Could be China today, because they built it 24 hours a day. There's electricity in 1871, and they lit the house, so they rebuilt the exact hotel. However, Potter Palmer, the owner of the hotel, said, it's the first, he markets it, advertised it as the first fireproof hotel in the world. So they immediately rebuilt it, but not just the same, but even better. We can do it. These are postcards from the Palmer Hotel that were published, or that were issued right after it was rebuilt. This is Chicago in 1880, so 9 years after the fire. Everything was rebuilt. You don't see any trace. And I call it the Phoenix Syndrome. It's hosting the World Fair even in 1893. So Chicago comes out strong after the disaster. My next example, a little bit later, the next decade, in Johnstown. Who of you has heard of Johnstown? The Johnstown flood, one of the big floods. The city itself is not that important, but the disaster was known to many Americans in the 19th century. This is Andrew Carnegie. He would have called himself Carnegie in Pittsburgh, where he was a steel magnate. You would say Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was a wealthy man, steel magnate, who was, in those days you didn't play golf when you had a lot of money. You liked fishing or hunting, and so he and his friends, they looked like this, would be fishing and hunting in that lake, 23 kilometers above Johnstown. The lake looked originally like this. It was a dam. It's a bit high here. They made sure that the water would be, they would rise the water. They actually lowered the wall. They even took out metal off the wall and sold it as scrap metal. Just imagine a steel magnate. And they started to build trees, which caused some erosion, had carriages go over it, and you can imagine what happens. One day the dam breaks. This is what it looked like. 2,200 people were killed in Johnstown, 23 kilometers down the dam. This is what Johnstown looked like. Debris, you see the bridge, some of the stone buildings still intact. Houses were just flushed down the river. There's a cemetery with 2 names on it, 800 people in this no-name cemetery. They didn't have DNA, so they didn't know who they found. And when visitors came later on, they didn't recognize the city. They came back, businessmen came back. I didn't find a single road. I read in some of these reports. So it was immediately rebuilt, and it became a thriving city once again. Interestingly, a journalist from the Johnstown Tribune, the local newspaper, said, it may be well to consider that the flood, that its train of horrors, is behind us, and that we have henceforth to do with the future alone. This is 1892. 1891 was the flood. A year later, we're not looking back. There's no memory. You don't want to remember it. We just look forward. That's what I mean by disaster optimism. Andrew Carnegie, who was really responsible, doesn't mention the flood at all in his autobiography. Nobody's ever held responsible for it. Interestingly, Andrew Carnegie actually gives money to Johnstown to build a library, but he mentions that in his autobiography, but he doesn't mention the flood. Nobody is held responsible. So I call it the ostrich syndrome. If you call the Johnstown flood a natural disaster, I think you are closing your eyes from what it actually is. It's really a human-made disaster, or it's both. So it's, of course, it's water that goes on, but it's also clearly engineered by humans because of, in this case, the stupidity and arrogance and hybris. But this is also connects with what I showed you before for the film. In the case of the Chicago fire, this is some of you may have heard of Coney Island, the theme park. It's a tourist attraction. So in New York, in upstate New York, they had a machine that showed the flood, the Johnstown flood. It showed how houses were flushed away, how people died. It's an electric machine that people were fascinated by. This. It was the most important, most popular, greatest financial success in Coney Island. It is the greatest electric scenic production in the world. So the disaster is actually celebrated. I will tell you that this thing was kept. However, Johnstown flood was exchanged once there was a casualty. Once there was a disaster with more casualties, with 8,000 casualties, the Galveston flood. So they always, it needs to be the best, and the most casualties made it worthy of, bringing it to Coney Island. Now I'm coming to my third example, so that you really believe what I'm saying. I'm beginning to believe it myself. San Francisco earthquake, very famous, 1906. A lot of insurance companies went bankrupt because they didn't expect this to happen. This is the earthquake. The city burned down. Nearly 80% of the city was destroyed. 3,000 plus people died. There were probably quite a few more, especially in Chinatown, because there was no register for the Chinese people, and they were also living in an area that had been filled up, and that was very vulnerable. And so 3,000 is a very, very cautious estimate, and 400,000 were left homeless. This is what the city looked like. However, in 1913, 7 years after the catastrophe, a seismologist says, shortly after the disaster, there was a general disposition, people believed, that the disposition was such that it amounted to concerted action for the purpose of suppressing all mention of that catastrophe. The less said, the sooner mended, and there hasn't been any earthquake, were the sentiments we heard on all sides. So scientists were kept silent. So if you wonder about climate denial, there is your history about keeping scientists down if it hurts the economic interests. Actually, the mayor said, he used the argument, there could also be a Trumpian argument, he used the argument, hey, look at the rest of the United States. You saw the map. There are these tornadoes, they're horrible, the hurricanes, there are all sorts of catastrophes in the United States, wind that are much more destructive. Here, it was just an earthquake that happens hardly ever. But they rebuilt, like in the case of Chicago, immediately with these machines. One of the engineers said, you don't design for earthquakes that occur every 2,000 years. It's not reasonable. Whether he actually believed it or not, granted, you probably know in 1849, gold was discovered close to San Francisco. That's when San Francisco really started. It was a very small village at the time, maybe 10 houses. But within a short time, it became a city. And there was a political interest by the mayor and others to make sure that the news was not about, that people wouldn't talk about the earthquake. So visitors who came to San Francisco after the fire in 1906, they all said, people say there was no earthquake. There was only a fire, because a fire can happen anywhere in the world. Actually, the mayor always said it's just a fire, and fires happen everywhere. And he had other examples of Baltimore fire in his statements. San Francisco, back to usual, postcard 4 years after the disaster. You just saw what it looked like in 1906. Okay, this was disaster optimism. Now moving to my much more complicated case. Can you still follow?
Yeah.
Okay, this is kind of complex because I'm looking at Hurricane Katrina versus Hurricane Betsy, and it happens within 40 years. Very similar in a way, but Hurricane Betsy was actually worse. As a meteorological event, it had a higher speed, and yet Hurricane Katrina has more deaths. Many more deaths, even though there was a lot of money pumped into New Orleans to protect it from a future hurricane. How did that happen? And I have to go really far back in history. Bush says, some of you may remember this, I do remember this, he said, I don't think anyone anticipated the breach of the levees that flooded New Orleans. However, there were so many reports, I'll give you just one, from the Scientific American in 2001, a big slow-moving hurricane would drown New Orleans under 20 feet of water because New Orleans was under the water, under the level of the ocean. So there were a lot of warnings, but politicians would say, no, nobody could have foreseen this. So it's a suppression, which is the other part of the coin, optimism on one hand, suppression on the other hand, ignorance, ignoring the disaster. And you could have known, look, there are unnamed 1856, Katrina, Betsy, Eleanor 1985, so they're now named, Frederick, Camille, hurricanes. You can see there were lots of hurricanes between 1852 and 2005, they all hit the New Orleans area, and Bush can say, nobody expected that this could happen. Here is the Galveston hurricane, very close to New Orleans, and it would have been very easy to prevent 8,000 people from dying if people had not lived on the island of Galveston. The island of Galveston was just gone after the hurricane in 1900. You remember this is now in Coney Island. Everybody is interested in the 8,000 casualties. But people lived and were expecting that one day it might happen. But yeah, so here comes the longue durée. I'm interested in, this is New Orleans. New Orleans is at the Mississippi. This is the Mississippi River. The Mississippi goes into the Gulf of Mexico. I'm still calling it Mexico. Some people call it the Gulf of America. This is a chicken foot. Watch this chicken foot because you'll see it in a minute. I'm now going much further back in history, into geology. This is how the land changed enormously. And as environmental historians, we're interested in how nature is an actor. You can see how the Mississippi River, basically this is the Mississippi River, at one point, because water always finds the way of the least resistance, at one point it moved further east. There's more and more land built up, but interestingly here's a chicken foot again, there is less land today. And one of the reasons for it has to do with what humans have done, and we get to that in a minute. Here is a very interesting old map from 1720. New Orleans, again here, it's a very long way all the way down here. I'm mentioning this because if only you could, from Lake Pontchartrain, there are several rivers already that are connected with the Gulf of Mexico. If only you could cut through here, then you would have an easy access to the Gulf of Mexico. And this would be so important because, of course, the Mississippi is a vein. It's a transportation venue that brings all sorts of goods through the whole of the United States. All this is a cypress swamp, and this means that it functions like a sponge. And you can see New Orleans is not a city. Many people think it's just at the Gulf, but it's an inland city. New Orleans is an inland city that is really protected by the cypress swamps. The cypress swamps look like this. Cypress swamps, this tree, for instance, they couldn't take it out, but cypress swamps had a lot of functions for people who lived in the area. There was wood, there was waterfowl, you could hunt there and you could fish there. There were all sorts of animals, water animals, oysters, shrimp, etc. So it was actually, but it had the one important function, it was a sponge. So it would take up the water if there was a hurricane. This is what it looks like. This 40% of all coastal wetlands are in this area where New Orleans is, in the lower Mississippi, very, very low. This was all basically built by sediment. Imagine the river going down, has a lot of sediment that brings it down, and so that sediment builds the land. You saw there was more and more land coming out. It moved to the east, but it's very fragile. It's very vulnerable. This is what it looks like. It's also spongy, not just a cypress swamp, but also this land is very spongy. This is the river, how it changed over time. Something that we forget, But you can see this, I don't know, I once cycled to Budapest from along the Danube, and it was interesting to see when you have multiple options to go on bike trails. You don't know which one to take because the river has taken different routes, and they always go along old arms of the river Danube. So there people know that the river moves. The river dances around. It moves from here to there. Interestingly, Native Americans who had lived there for hundreds of thousands of years knew how to deal with it. So they would only go into the lower Mississippi at certain times. Not in the winter, there were many risks. Not in the summer, it was too hot, too many mosquitoes. But they would go there for hunting, and they would go there for fishing. But as soon as the Europeans came, so here you can see this is an old map that shows some of the Native Americans, but also some of the settlements. This is a French map. But this is what a European city looks like, very geometric. New Orleans, this is the old part of New Orleans. You see it's higher up, so it's relatively protected. And if you live in that part of New Orleans, you have no problem with the flood when a hurricane comes. And why? Maybe you can imagine, this is the bank, so on the left bank going down the Mississippi, imagine this is where New Orleans is. This is where the swamps are on both sides. This is below the water level of the ocean. This is really high up. And imagine that the river, because of snow melt, because of all sorts of things, moves up and down all the time. Imagine this to go up, down, up, down, up, down. And when it goes down, more and more sediment heaps up here. This is why these areas are higher. And the first Europeans who went and built a settlement in New Orleans lived here, which was kind of smart. New Orleans grows. In 1840, it's the third largest city. And here you can see, remember the lake. They would have really loved to have a canal going from the Mississippi River to the lake, because then they could have a shortcut to the Gulf of Mexico. However, this was not possible because the Mississippi is much higher than the lake. So they built a canal, but the canal, this is the canal that they built, the canal can only go to the back of New Orleans. But it's still quite good because from here they can transport things up and down the canal. It would have been great if they could cut through there, but it's impossible. Now this is what it looks like there. This is a charcoal ship. They were connecting the backside of here, the backside of the city with the lake. The lake is up here, and they would bring lime, tar, pitch, oysters, charcoal, clay for bricks, timber. There's a charcoal boat off the canal. The canal doesn't exist anymore, and it's interesting, if you look at the map of New Orleans today, the canals still exist as streets, because at one point it was cheaper to have transportation on highways. So the canal still exists as a venue. It's exactly the same. All these former canals became roads once it was cheaper to use a car or a truck. This is something, it's really something, an aside. Just for you to remember, if you are an Americanist, you know that New Orleans is extremely multi-diverse, very, very ethnic. Here you see Germans, African Americans, mixed Chinese, this is around 1900, Filipino, mixed Creole, ethnic white. New Orleans was always very diverse. Diversity is an important factor in the history of New Orleans, but it's also important when it comes to understanding the role, and I'm interested in culture here. What is the cultural disposition in the United States? Very different from later on. You see, I call it the gumbo factor, environmental richness and ethnic richness in the United States. This is rice cultivation. You see here, the African Americans were relatively free in New Orleans. They had a higher standing than some of the immigrants, higher than the Irish, for instance. They were mingling. And the food was also very much a mix of different cultures. So there was a natural wealth. Imagine you live in this swamp and you can use the resources of the swamp. There's hardly any part of the world that has more opportunity. You can have rice, everything in your neighborhood. You just need to know how to deal with nature. You need to know how the environment reacts. And for some reason, it worked really well. There was a lot of this is natural wealth. I don't know whether you've ever had alligators to eat. In Florida, you can get alligator bites. So it's not that the alligator bites you, but you bite the alligator. Croatians, sometime in the 19th century, developed the oyster industry. That was their expertise. Chinese brought the technique of drying shrimp. This was really important because before you could dry shrimp, you couldn't transport them. But dry shrimp you can take anywhere in the United States or ship it abroad, ship it to Europe. Sugar processing came from the West Indies. Architecture was Spanish and Haiti, also West Indies. And then the French were really good in mapping. By the way, the French, I didn't mention this even though it's really important. I should have put it on the slide. If you want to understand the French, they're very different from the British in America. This is America. For you, this is East? Yeah?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. It took the British hundreds of years to cross the Appalachians. They were afraid of the mountains. They were afraid of Native Americans. They didn't understand. If they understood anything, they understood the land, but they didn't understand the rivers. The French were living along the Mississippi. They mingled a lot with Native Americans, and they were able to move around on rivers. So they didn't have a lot of streets, but they moved on canoes, and so they had a much closer relationship with Native Americans, and they were much closer to nature. So the French were able to do maps, and in the beginning New Orleans was French. The French understood the river in a way that the British or the Americans didn't understand it. And in 1803, some of you know, very important for Americanists, Jefferson, whoops, do we not have that? Okay, in 1803, Jefferson bought Louisiana, but I have this so as an illustration. This is a house in the style of the West Indies. So it's raised, first of all, but it's also got a camel back, that's what it's called. So if there's a small flood, if there's a little flood, nothing happens, and if there's a very bad flood, you can still move up to the higher ground. This type of architecture comes from the West Indies, from places like Haiti. So the Spanish also knew it, they brought it to this part of the world, but the British didn't care about it anymore. Look at the houses that were built in recent decades in New Orleans, nothing like that. That would have been too expensive, nobody did that. So here's the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson buys this area, but you can see why he bought it. Because he wanted to make sure that he had access to the Gulf of Mexico. Going down the Mississippi was lucrative. And especially, there are various factors that make it lucrative to go down the river. And one of the factors that one must not forget, but is often forgotten, is technology, technological innovation. So you've got ships. You know what ships used to look like? Ships go down deep. They're not that high. Here it's really flat. These are flat boats. They go up high, so you can load a lot on it. You can go on a river that is low. And all of a sudden, if you can transport a lot on the river, then it becomes lucrative to cut the canal that you always wanted to cut. All of a sudden, it's worth it. It's an enormous engineering enterprise. You need to build several locks, several dams in order to do it. But with these boats, all of a sudden, technology drives your interest because it becomes economically of interest. So these ships are one of the factors for building the canal that is supposed to be supposed to be built. Here you see, these are all, where you see the blue, these are all cypress swamps. Remember, they were sponges. This area is below sea level. This lake is lower than the Mississippi, so you couldn't cut through, but here they were able to cut through from the Mississippi to the lake with locks in between. Because it became lucrative. It was very expensive, but all of a sudden an engineering project that was worthwhile was organized. Of course, once you have these, you drain the land, it's no longer a common. You saw how the cypress swamp was used by many people. It was a common, but the British, or the Americans at this point, 1803, privatized the land. Speculators came in, investors who said, okay, once it's a swamp, everybody can have it, but if it's privatized, I can make a profit. So there was outside money that came in. This is what it looked like, the dredging of the big canal that American New Orleans, I call it American New Orleans, built a large-scale new canal project, a technocratic approach. Actually, the Irish had to build this, not slaves, interestingly, not former slaves, not Africans. That many of them died, which is a history that is often forgotten, but hundreds of, probably thousands of people died in digging out these, in the heat, with malaria. So they may have died not of heat, but of mosquito bites and malaria. And here you see what I've talked about before. Here's the lake. Can you still follow?
Yeah.
The lake is lower than the Mississippi River. This is the Mississippi River. This is sea level. If you see photos of Hurricane Katrina, they come from here. Mm-hmm. It's below the sea level. In order to make sure that no water flows through here, once you've drained the land, you have to build levees or dams all over. And so in the beginning, they built New Orleans here, then they built it here and there. It was still sort of just above sea level, and people understood, this is, but once they started to build here, it became kind of difficult. Along the lake, this is UNO, is University of New Orleans, that was also higher up. But in order to make sure that a hurricane or a flood wouldn't destroy the buildings, they had to build here. This is a 17.5 foot dam, and here is a 23-foot dam on top of the high bank. But here is the Inner Harbor Navigation Canal, also called the Industrial Canal. That's the canal they built to connect the Mississippi with the lake. It was built between 1918 and 1923. So in the 20th century, something fundamental changed. You see the geometry of these canals, and there was no more interest in understanding, there was no interest in the environmental function of the swamp. Instead, there was an interest in getting a lot of money out of the land. And as soon as it was land, it was lucrative. But there were very few people who could invest. Well, these are the walls. This is what it looks like. They don't look very promising. They are not the best of all walls. But here you see a lock. It's still in place today. It's a very old lock. It's from 1923, over 100 years old. So they had to build locks in order to move the water from the lake to the Mississippi. Okay, this is a story that I cannot really tell you quickly, but I find it's good to remember, that money needs to get into a city in order to develop it. So you need investors. In the case of New Orleans, isn't it strange that one of the famous figures that buildings and streets are named after is Jean Lafitte. Jean Lafitte is a pirate. All he does is, go against ships, get stuff, basically steal it, and bring the money into New Orleans. Who profits? The pirate profits more than anybody else. But I'm using this as an example to show you what is needed for development is an investor. And usually it's an investor who comes from the outside. Today it's often, it could be a real estate investor, like Trump could be a multimillionaire, but it could also be Washington, D.C. could invest if they think it's worthwhile. There's development going on and the economy goes up. So you need an outside investor. The city itself doesn't have enough money, so there's always an outside investor. I'm just using this figure for you to remember that money is needed. Remember there's a technological driver. You need, but also philosophy. The philosophy that economics are more important than environmental understandings. The function of the environment is lost. Money is what dictates the development. I could show you, this is very interesting from the Journal of Sociology in 1976, the city as a growth machine. I will drop that, it's from Moloch, But basically he says that every American city, the political and economic essence of any locality in America is growth. So people, there's land, but if it's wet, it doesn't help. So the idea is everything has to grow, and where you already have a settlement, just want to grow. Look at Miami. I think Miami is something that I'm really, really interested in. If you look at Miami, it's crazy that people are still building in Miami Beach. You can be sure that Miami Beach won't be around in 50 years. But the people who are really rich have moved out of Miami Beach and invested in areas that are really slums at this point, in West Coconut Beach, because it's higher. It's totally slummy, but now it's becoming gentrified. So investors know where to invest, but they also build as long as they can make money. And Miami is, for me, one of the greatest examples, because we all know, every environmental historian and every disaster management predictor prophet will say Miami Beach will be gone in 100 years. There's no way that it can still be there. You can't build walls. It's not like Venice. Or New York would probably be protected to some extent. It's possible, but Miami Beach will be gone. All these big hotels. So remember, this is New Orleans, 200 years ago. But my argument is that it was 20th century. Remember, the Industrial Canal was built in 1918 to 23. It's 20th century New Orleans. The part built after the drainage system was constructed that flooded in the late summer of 2005. So it's not a 19th century city. It's certainly not what the Native Americans had in mind when they understood the relationship between humans and nature, but it's a 20th century city. This is the area that was flooded in Hurricane Katrina. Here you see Jourdan. I don't know, is it Jourdan Avenue? I'm not from New Orleans. I've visited, but I know very little about it. But here you see Jourdan. It's the sea would be here. The river would be here. This is the lower Nine. Some of you remember everybody was reporting the lower Nine is flooded. It's the first picture that I showed you of New Orleans being flooded. This is it, Jourdan Avenue in Hurricane Katrina. You see how close, this is the levee, an artificial levee, 150 feet from the levee is Jourdan Avenue. Here it breaks and it floods. And this is below the sea level. No way for these people to survive. But it was not foreseeable. So this is what it looks like. I'm calling it disaster amnesia. And I think you can learn from the mistakes that were made. 1965, you still had a functioning public transportation system. If you look into American history, after World War II, there were the automobile industry. The state built highways. They had a lot of money after World War II. They they got rid of the old cities and built suburbs. The white population went into the suburbs. The people went by car into the suburbs. That was the standard. All of a sudden, cars were important. The rubber industry was profiting enormously. They were buying up the tram system all over the United States, pulling out the tracks in order to make sure that there would be no public transportation, but cars instead, an automobile culture. So this was a problem in New Orleans because not everybody had a car. Even those who had a car could not leave because there were too many cars. And even those who had a car and would have loved to leave couldn't leave because they were too poor to buy gasoline. So 100,000 residents do not have access to private cars, and they don't have money for fuel. Architecture, you saw it before. Architecture on stilts. You saw the Camelback house. These are types of houses that were historic. They look like this. But these are the houses that were constructed in the area that you just saw that was flooded below the sea level. Absolutely not protected. It continues like this. There used to be 180 shelters. Often schools, relatively well built, double-story schools, a whole network. Indeed, there was never more than a mile between these shelters. But in the end, the only shelter that exists is the Superdome, and you remember the hygienic disaster. So I call it the preparedness paradox. Belief in techno-fixes and modern infrastructures will cause erosion and increase vulnerability, and a false sense of security. You've got these dams. You think you're in Jordan Avenue. There's a dam in front of you. Nothing can happen. Usually nothing happens. The water never comes up. But once it comes up, it's very dangerous, and it causes enormous damage. In the case of New Orleans, they got billions of dollars from Washington, but only under the condition that they would protect something. So you build a dam, and so they had to build houses behind the dam, behind the levee. It would have been wise not to build a dam, or even if you built a dam, not to build houses in that area that was disaster prone. But they actually built a lot of houses as cheaply as possible to show that this dam protects a lot of property. That's how they got money from Washington. Here is the story that goes back to my geology image from the beginning. You can see that there's a lot of sediment going down, but the one thing that I want to turn your attention to is the yellow. These are locks, 6 dams that are built in the 1960s. This is the upper river. New Orleans is here in the lower river. And it's really important, as environmental historians, we have to think not only transnationally, but transregionally, and in terms of, a river as an entity, not just at a locality. So don't focus on New Orleans alone. If you understand that you built 6 locks or 6 dams up here, this has an impact, not just on what's happening here. The water is used for agriculture. Less water comes down, less sediment comes down. And you will remember that there was sediment building up, but all of a sudden, instead of building up land, you have erosion. Remember the chicken foot. This is what it looks like in reality. You need to build, this is Highway 1 in Louisiana. You need to build levees along the Highway 1 in order for people to be able to travel on this road. And you can imagine what happens to this road in a few years, in a few decades. This is a map that you normally see represented in atlases, but it's the land that is normally represented, and here is the land that is firm. The rest, it can only be lived on because it's protected by levees. Here you see it, how it changed in 35 years. Look at this area, for instance, how much land there is, and how much land has been lost since. Even I think people live in New Orleans are not aware. I mean, show them these maps. It's crazy, and it's human-made. So, I mean, you want me to talk about disaster preparedness, I tell you how you're unprepared, how you're creating unpreparedness, how you're really killing, the opportunity to be secure. Look at the land loss in coastal Louisiana. Between 1930 and in 90 years, you lost like 5,000 square kilometers of land in Louisiana because of engineering projects along the Mississippi River and because of agriculture using too much water. And this is the future. What happens in times of global warming, climate change? Red is below annual flood level. These areas will probably be lost because then there's no rich people are living here, so they will have to move. New Orleans, interestingly, is here. You see, along the river, it's not a problem. It's not flood prone because along the river you have the banks, so you can actually live there. You should actually build a city along here. But the city of New Orleans is everywhere else as well. This is what was flooded. This is a lake. And if it's, and then of course you see this highway, it can only survive because of the levees that are built along the highway. So with this, I'm switching to Venice. It's my last point, and I hope I can explain that to you. This is actually what I'm really interested in. And I think it's the most amazing city in the world, because for hundreds of years, it's built on wood. There's much more wood below Venice than above. But Venice is sitting on a forest. The reason why nothing happens is because there's no oxygen, so the wood actually remains. Actually, this church no, I don't want to go into details. That's a problem. Okay, but there are things that you all know. What is the problem of Venice? First of all, sea level is rising, so you know it's sinking. Then, of course, something that is never really mentioned is that the weight of the buildings brings the land down. But the most important thing that never anybody mentions is the underground water. As soon as Venice industrialized, Mestre and Porto Marghera, which is the main land, they needed water for the industry. And they took it from underneath Venice. That's when it sank dramatically. So it's again an engineered, it's a human-made problem to some extent. We all talk about climate change and how Venice is sinking, but it is sinking for other reasons as well. Interestingly, people were able to deal with this precarious situation for hundreds and hundreds of years. And how? I think this is emblematic in the double sense, in the actual sense of the word. So water and land fighting each other. There's a marriage between water and land celebrated each year in Venice, because from early modern times onwards, people understood that you need to live with nature in Venice. You need to live with water. Water was absolutely important. Water was important for two reasons. First of all, Venice doesn't have, remember, if you go down the Canale Grande, if you've been there, there are no walls. The only walls in Venice are around the Arsenale, which is the factory for ships. You know, ships were really important. If you don't have ships, you lose. You can't live there anymore. So you make sure that you have walls around. Nobody can spy and see what they're doing in there. They build 1,000 ships every year. So it's really military protection. The water protects because you can't come in with big ships. They had all sorts of things like chains in the water in the lagoon, but they also, you know, it was very difficult to move around. If somebody comes, I mean, Napoleon was able in the end, but if you have a big ship that goes down deep, you get stuck before you reach Venice. So this is protective, but it's also, of course, important for trade. It's absolutely, without water, Venice is nothing. And Venice would be like, so it's protected by shallow waters. I call it the water-land conviviality. And so it is important for Venice to keep its insular. It's so important that, I mean, remember what the Mississippi does? If sediment comes down, water turns into land. And if that happens, so here, by the way, here you see, these are all former rivers. This is the Giudecca Canal. This is the Canale Grande. This used to be, by the way, so this Venice is a fish. This is a straw, that's the railway line. This is a lagoon. Here are some walls along the lagoon. And, but you can see there is this understanding that these were all rivers at one point. But where have these rivers gone? And why are they no longer there? These are the rivers in Venice. This is an old map. People understood fully. Look at this map. It's not a map of a city. It's a map of water and land. And you understand that this water needs to be protected. Because if there's sediment, then the city looks like Ravenna. I was hoping I had a picture of Ravenna, or of Naples that lost its port, and Ravenna's port is on the mainland. But here, this is an understanding. This shows you, this old map shows you that Venice feels protected by water. And if this is gone, if it's mainland, then Venice loses its major function as a trade city. This is St. Mark's Square. This Giudecca, the Giudecca Canal. This is the mainland. Many islands. Okay, this is Ravenna. So Ravenna looked like Venice, but they didn't do anything about it. The Venetians knew in order to keep the water, we need to do something dramatic. What they did was amazing. In 1548, 1610, 1683, they made sure that, so Venice is here. This is the fish. This is where the railway line comes in. They made sure that the water that was flow down there, that would flow down there into the area of Venice, would be diverted, because it would sediment, it would clog up the lagoon, and Venice would become a land city instead of a lagoon city. So they built, instead of this, they built this canal. Instead of this, they built that canal. And here they built that canal. So the water doesn't flow into the lagoon anymore, and Venice has water forever. So the problem for Venice for hundreds of years was too much sediment. Today it's the opposite. But they made sure that there wouldn't be too much sediment. They're not thinking the same way today to make sure that they would be protected by water. So they haven't done any of these enormous engineering projects to do the opposite. But for hundreds of years, they were very sensitive to what would happen if they lose the water. And they were so sensitive, I was really struck when I learned this from Pietro Amodeo, who is an early modernist and who has shown us that the magistrate of waters, first of all, there's a magistrate of waters. There is an understanding of what the water means, but they don't just look at water as water, they look at water as the livelihood for fish and for all sorts of species. I mean, these are Mueke fishermen. I interviewed some of them, they're really interesting. They know so much about the land. The one I interviewed, his family had been, fishing for 400 years. So they know everything about it. They know if there's a slight change, they say, oh, this is 50 centimeters higher than last year. I don't find that part anymore, because they know where to go to fish. And so they asked the fishermen, what has happened since we did, we built these new canals? And so it was a questionnaire, and they were always aware, they were extremely sensitive to, what the engineering did to the natural environment. And that's something that they did for hundreds of years. And if you made a mistake, one of my favorite places in Venice is San Erasmo. It's a vegetable island. There are very few people living there. It's almost as big as Venice. But if you can make money if you have more land. So if you drain the land, then you can build artichokes or whatever, all sorts of vegetables for hundreds of years. But if you did that, it would cause sedimentation. And people who did that in the past were punished so badly. They had to go on a galera, on a ship, like slaves for years, if they were caught in sedimenting the lagoon. But there were other, like this is, if they destroyed a wall, along the lagoon, there were walls. They would be, publicis aquis, so the waters are public. And if you did this, if you interfered, you would be a hostis patria, you would be an enemy of the fatherland. So it was treason. To destroy the wall, to build a drainage canal, that was treason. So they knew all the time how important it was in order to survive, to keep the livelihood, to understand what grows and how much sand you need, how much land you need, how much water you need, how much works out. So this land-water conviviality was something that's totally missing. The Americans didn't understand it. Native Americans probably didn't understand it in that way. This was very, very, very regulated, extremely regulated. There was a lot of punishment if you made mistakes. And the same is true. I've been fascinated by this. You saw you need a lot of wood. And we always talk about Karlovitz being the inventor of sustainability. In reality, Venice had invented sustainability much earlier. They had counted all the trees that they had access to on the mainland. Every tree, they worked out how many 100 years it would take to produce certain types of wood, because they knew they could not survive if they couldn't build 1,000 ships a year. They needed different types of wood, oak, for instance, for the rowing, but different ones for the nave. And so they made sure that they had enough wood. They could have had enough wood forever if Napoleon had invaded. So it was a thinking about sustainability. How can we sustain the water, the relationship between land and water? And they didn't take the wood from close by. Sometimes they bought it from Constantinople deliberately, so they would not kill their own resources. And then, of course, imagine the lagoon is salt water, and you need sweet water. You need fresh water. And men, it was very gendered, so men would bring, there were mills, water mills, they would bring the water from rivers, from the Brenta River, bring it to Venice, and women would sell it, and it was put into these fountains, and it was shared in a way that was fair, so that there would be enough water for everybody. Of course, there were aristocrats who had several of these fountains and wells in their backyard, but it was made sure that everybody would have water, fresh water, so that everybody would survive. It was a very different understanding from what it is today. Here, there was also a culture, a bit like in the Filipino case. here's a hairdresser. This is 1966. It was the biggest flood in a long time, and was really a major, major, major disaster. But if you talk to people in Venice today who are my age, they will tell you when they were little, they were learning how to move in the water when the water was like this high. They could still walk around. It was ingrained in them. So it was also a bit like in the case of the Philippines. They knew how to deal with water. It was not necessarily the enemy. It was just understanding that this reoccurs and you have to somehow live with it. And this is something that is lost, and you didn't see that in New Orleans. Banksy here, it looks a little bit more faint today, but I like the term by Ilan Kelman of Venice's risk personality. So the personality of Venice changed from a sustainable, personality to that managed its archipelago. I call it archipelago, not archipelago, to a fragile one. So it's now struggling with existential threats, with land loss, over-tourism, and social erosion. So this has changed over the last few decades, in part because of the industrialization of the mainland, in part because they needed to have big ships enter, not just cruise ships, but also for the industry, for the harbor. They had to dredge in the lagoon, and so the water flow changed totally. So with the same questionnaire from the 16th century, they would have known that so many fish have become extinct for that reason. But they didn't do that, and they prioritized, like in the case of New Orleans, they prioritized economic interests, the cruise ships and the oil tankers that would go into Marghera, into the Plata and the mainland. And finally, well, here you can see what they're doing. This is Mosse, it's the mobile barrier that goes up. Here you can see these floodgates are open, the floodgates here are closed. So the whole lagoon, this Lido, the beach, the lagoon can actually close down if there's a big flood. And people, one of the things that I find totally interesting, all of a sudden the first floors on the houses are used now and are rented to tourists. Because if the water goes up by 1 meter 20, St. Mark's Square is still flooded, but that's nice because it's also good for pictures. But we know that our feet will be dry, and we live in an area where 1 meter 20 is no problem, so we can actually rent the houses on the first floor to tourists. So before that, there were magazines and other things in the first floor, and people would live in the second floor in Venice. It's a little bit like in the case of New Orleans. This is my last slide, I think. It's a little bit like New Orleans. You lose, because of sedimentation loss, because of all these engineering projects, the dredging projects, you lose salt marshes. But it's also realized that these salt marshes are extremely important ecologically, and there are now a lot of grassroots initiatives that built these salt marshes. Salt marshes are basically like the cypress swamps, so they're sponges. And so there is some soil bioengineering going on. Universities are involved in this. And so here are my takeaways. I don't know whether I want to read them to you, but well, maybe I do. Disasters are important events, not because there are so many fatalities. Remember, not many fatalities, but because of economic impact. Economics is key. Secondly, meteorological events don't cause disasters. Thirdly, an event becomes a disaster because of a sighting of a community. So why do you build houses along the coast of Texas, Louisiana, South Carolina, where the hurricanes hit? You know that you're not preparing for disaster. You're preparing yourself to be in a disaster. And yet, because you have so much insurance, remember, you have so much insurance, and it doesn't kill you, a lot of people get a lot out of it. I just met somebody whose father bought a house in Los Angeles for $30,000 after the war and got $8 million back from the insurance after the fire this year. He's 93 years old. He almost died in the disaster. He had to be lifted out by helicopter, but he's insured, so it's actually good for his kids. And his attitudes, beliefs, and values matter. Culture matters. Culture co-determines our adaptation, our adaptive capacities. Cultural richness has added to smart adaptation. Remember, New Orleans, diversity has helped to understand how you can use natural resources in a sustainable way. Modernity's mindset has led to protective structures, but also to increased risk-taking. That's, remember the Risk Society by Ulrich Beck. So we live in a society that is deliberately taking risks. We reflect about it, but basically it has led to the preparedness paradox that we take things for granted, we forget about it, or we deliberately take risks, or we ignore them. The modern pursuit of rational order can paradoxically cause irrational outcomes. So we think we are doing the right thing, but we are organizing, we are constructing rational engineering projects, but in the end it leads to an irrational decision. The strive for efficiency and capitalist rationality have often led to concealment and the suppression of risk, thereby increasing vulnerability. The US has a history of optimism bias that contributes to playing down risks. Americans have an obsession with catastrophe in popular culture. Remember Hollywood, Coney Island. Disasters exacerbated social inequality because elites are financially cushioned against losses and historically, for the most part, have not been held accountable. Remember Johnstown, and maybe this is my last. Many so-called natural disasters are de facto engineered disasters. This is my last. Environmental history teaches us to think of natural catastrophes as chronic, non-acute, and in the longue durée. So we should always, this is my lesson basically, I'm not talking about preparedness in a way, what do you do tomorrow to protect yourself from erosion in Malibu? There's also land erosion at the beach. What do you do to make sure that the fire doesn't eat your house up? You can cut down the brush. For hundreds of years in Malibu, Native Americans have burned down the brush because they could control it. So they lived with nature. And the same way people lived with water in some of the cases that we looked at. So environmental history, I think we have to think in the longue durée. Don't just think about what's happening today, and that's what we're doing all the time. Politicians are doing it, our politicians are doing it. We should think about nature as an actor that has evolved. Even go back to geology, look at the hydrology, look at how rivers change, how we change and approach it, and how we can live with nature. I think that's the lesson. It's a very basic lesson from environmental history, but I think it's extremely important. So thank you very much.